Morning or good afternoon. We're running slightly late. My name is Jorge Quiroga, former president of Bolivia, South America, when I was young and irresponsible. It's a pleasure to be here in Baku once again for the third forum. I have been here a few times before with the joint collaboration we've had before with the Club de Madrid, the gathering of former heads of state, and it's a pleasure to be back again. I thank everyone for convening here from different parts of the world. Many of you, I'm sure, have come from further away than I have, but I think no one has come from as high as I have come. The airport in my city is 4,000 meters. It's a big home court advantage in soccer. And the great Lionel Messi from Barcelona scores everywhere except in La Paz. So if you're a Bayern Munich fan or Real Madrid fan and you want to beat Barcelona, play in La Paz and the altitude. That helps a little bit. Thank you. Welcome to this session on the key challenges for the emerging world order. I'll introduce some of the speakers, but first we will hear some opening remarks from President Abdullah Gül of Turkey. Sir, if you'd like to take the podium and give us some opening remarks for this session.
Açılış sözlerini dinleyek. Buyurun, Canab Gül.
President, dear friends, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am immensely pleased to attend the third Global Baku Forum organized by Nizami Ganjavi International Center. I am happy especially to find the opportunity to see and meet many old friends here. I find it very opportune that the forum dwells on the issue of establishing confidence in new world order. Our daily experiences prove sufficiently the rightness of this assertion. It's true that the 15 years of 21st century have unfortunately not passed as lenient as we hope for the humanity. An atmosphere of violence, hatred, lawlessness, and egoism, not befitting the level of human civilization, affects all of us. Political, ideological conflicts and disintegrations cannot be prevented despite the economic independency created by globalization and increasing communication networks. This state of affairs brings forth further questions and quests on the existing world order. We are all well aware of the great paradoxes and deep crises we are living through. Dear friends, United Nations and regional cooperation systems, which are the products of lessons drawn from two large-scale wars of the last century are based in principle on accurate premises. The soundness of their foundation principles hold through today as well. However, 70 years have passed since then. It is evident that these structures have not been able to keep up with the changing conditions in the world. We all agree that multilateral decision-making processes, particularly UN Security Council, should be more representative and more democratic. However, no result has been obtained from the ongoing efforts exerted towards the Security Council reform for approximately 30 years within the United Nations. It is obvious that dignity, credibility, and influence of the United Nations and Security Council are gradually withering away. The disappointments caused by unresolved, deepening, and sharpening problems across the world and the reactions created as a result must have backlashes at one point. Then, however, it may be too late for us to redress the situation. Therefore, it is high time for everyone to act with responsibility on this issue. Will everything be all right if the Security Council becomes more democratic and effective? Of course not. Yet such a reform will result in freshness, energy, and self-confidence in the international community and system. In addition to the Security Council reform, the prevailing notions, spirit, and style in international relations today should be changed in a more positive way as well. Especially, we observe that natural political or economic incidents happening in one end of the world may affect all others in the contemporary world. Thus, we need more than ever an awareness on common interests based on common values. In this sense, multilateralism continues to be the most important instrument. However, this instrument is effective only if it stands on a high moral ground. Just as human rights standards and applications have arisen, more principles on which international relations are carried out should also be boosted. A moral ground and its mechanisms where no double standards are allowed should be created. This should draw its strength from legitimacy and depend on mutual interest. For example, Russia's invasion of one part of Ukraine territory have sent deep concerns around the world. Some measures have been taken, particularly in the United States and the European Union, and sanctions have been imposed as a result. On the other hand, the territory of Azerbaijan, our host country, is under occupation for more than 20 years. More than 1 million refugees are still far from their homes. Although the issue poses an obstacle to cooperation and security in the region, the response of the third parties have remained inadequate. No sincere contributions have been offered by the international community to the solution of this problem. Similarly, the occupation of Palestine affects deeply and negatively the world peace is under occupation, imposes deep and widespread negative effects beyond its size in terms of world peace incommensurate with its scale. It's appalling that the international system, which is aware of this and other problems, fails to offer solutions. Thus, it's necessary that the organizations which aim at confidence building and cooperation at regional level should be expanded and strengthened in addition to the United Nations. It is also recommendable that strong relations and mechanisms among these of regional organizations need to be established. The OSCE example in Europe has in some cases succeed, while it has failed in some others. Likewise, it has been observed that the regulations related to the prevention of the proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction became successful only when they were based on trust and cooperation through the participation and contribution of all the relevant parties. At this point, I would like to emphasize the importance of efforts for establishing and developing partnership beyond the borders of the European Union, even if satisfying results are not obtained all the time. These are valuable lessons for the international community to benefit from. Ladies and gentlemen, the situation is not different in terms of the management of the global economy either. The coexistence of small and large economies is possible only through multilateral arrangements. The expansion of G8, which brings together the major economics, towards G20 by including some other countries, has been a positive first step, albeit not sufficient. In the same way, IMF reforms increase efficiency and legitimacy of international financial architecture. Improving multilateral trade systems, resisting against protectionism, and removing the obstacles to free trade are also of importance, because these processes will be able to lay a basis for world peace by contributing to global growth and interdependency. This begins so growth should be encouraged to be comprehensive in a way that will spread prosperity at both national and global level. Reforms to this effect will be able to eliminate reactions and risks and will contribute to the improvement of political atmosphere. Finally, I would like to express the following. As you know, it has been a common belief until very recently that market economies could function successfully only under the conditions of pluralist liberal democracy. Nonetheless, contrary to this belief, we detect recently the emergence of an understanding, championing, and authoritarian-style capitalism drawing on some experiences, in particular the Chinese model and the Russian practices. It should not be overlooked that market economies are efficient only if they are transparent. It should be remembered that financial crises and depressions in the world arise from lack of transparency, particularly in the banking sector. Excellencies, climate change and refugee flows, threats of Islamophobia and racism, drugs, terrorism, and violence do not differentiate between their targets. Neither former nor future actors of the world order will be immune from these threats. Therefore, while there is enough justification to give priority to the security concerns in the 21st century, there are also ample ways to achieve this purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for those opening remarks. We'll now move in the following fashion, trying to address some of those key challenges. I'm sure there's a long list of key challenges that the world faces, whether it's migration coming to Europe, migration going to North America, radical extreme violence, North American self-sufficiency in energy that will dramatically change the world. I come from a part of the world where it's seen some changes. I think after half a century, the U.S. and Cuba engaging in discussions is certainly a game changer. Peace process in Colombia is certainly a game changer. And many other issues that I think are of interest to many of us. We'll move on to the panelists now, trying to address some of these things. And I've learned that to read what theoreticians write is very interesting, but it's much more productive to hear from policy practitioners. Theoreticians give you the know-how, public policy practitioners give you the how-to-do, and how they did it, and what they learned from those experiences. So I will move in that regard to the panelists that we have. Asking, I guess we're very long in time, but we'll take the time to listen to all the panelists, 5 to 7 minutes. Hopefully we'll have time for discussion after that. And I will move first to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien of Canada. He was in office for close to 10 years, comes from North America. It used to be a pipe dream to say that North America will be energy self-sufficient. That's been said for 40 to 50 years, but lo and behold, it is about to happen. And North America is also actively engaging in the transatlantic trade agreement, trans-Pacific trade agreement. And that is a dramatic change when the place in the world that has the largest economy, North America, is energy self-sufficient, has trade links inside of North America, and then develops further links to the Atlantic and Pacific. It certainly brings about a dramatic change. So with that, Prime Minister Chrétien, your perspective, please, from Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. You gave me a topic to speak about that is not the same that you gave me last night. But yes, perhaps I should talk about this big development that is occurring in North America with becoming self-sufficient in energy. That is a dramatic change. You know, for many of the years, we're all preoccupied about security of supply. The United States were extremely preoccupied about it. The mic is not functioning?
Closer. Closer. Closer.
All right. I will take it closer. All right. So that was a problem that dominated North America for a long time and had a lot of influence on international policies because they were always preoccupied to have enough energy to maintain this big economy in good standing. But in the last few years, it's been dramatic change on that. The United States has become self-sufficient in energy. And if you add to that the surplus of energy that we have in Canada, that means that North America is in extremely good shape. And I guess that some will say that for the next 75 or 100 years, there will be no need for the American and Canadian market for energy coming from abroad. In fact, one of the problems we're having in Canada this time, we have a surplus of oil. And we try to find ways to dispose of it. We wanted to sell some, and some want to buy it in the United States, but because of the ecological situation, you know, we're blamed somewhat because we have huge reserve of oil in Canada in the tar sand. They say that the quantity of oil there is as big as the tar sand, as big as the oil in Saudi Arabia. But the transformation of the tar sand into oil need a lot of energy and cause pollution. And it is a challenge for us to be able to produce this oil at much lower level of pollution, and I think we can do that. But if North America does not need to go abroad in the Middle East and other places like that to get oil, even to be dependent on Venezuela to have oil, that's changed the politics of America and of the world. So my view is that this will have a lot of influence. The Americans will lose probably interest in many parts of the world. And when you watch the debate that's going on at this moment in preparation for the next election, we hear more and more people who are becoming, more retrenching, not to be involved as much as they were. What they used to call Pax Americana is no more part of the debate anymore. And if they retrench, that would change a lot of the situation in the world, because the Middle East will be less important for them. The Venezuela, with all the big problem they have, will be less of a problem for America. And that, is it good or bad? I'm not sure. Because if you look in the last 50 years, the dynamism of the dynamic people of America have been a great motor for the progress in the world. All the technologies advance in the world, most of it came from America, like it or not. And I hope that will keep going on, because it's needed. And I hope that this development will not reduce the need of participation of everybody. Because for me, for example, I'm here. There's not many North Americans who are at this meeting. You're from South America, and I am the only one North American probably at the meeting, officially. And the president of the speaker who spoke before us, spoke about that, is the rules of the world have to be applied. And it's getting more and more difficult, because he referred to the international institution that exists. The United Nations, for example, is not functioning as it should, because it's supposed to be there to promote democracy, but it is not a very democratic institution, with the veto rights of 5 members and no way to break it. So many in the past, when the United Nations were speaking, they were listened to. What I'm observing in the last 10 years, they are unfortunately become more and more irrelevant. And this is a very dangerous thing, because there's no other body. You see the situation at this moment that you have in Iraq. It is a coalition of friends, but friends of whom? Is it of Iraq or of the Americans? We have a controversy in Canada. I was Prime Minister when we refused to go to the war in Iraq. It was not easy for Canada, because it was the first time ever that there was a war where the Americans and the Brits were involved and the Canadians were not there, and gave a great sense of independence in Canada. But why I was able to say no is because, contrary to the previous war that was under the father Bush, in Kuwait, it was approved by the United Nations. In the case of the war in Iraq, the second one on George W., they didn't have the approval of the United Nations. I remember my debate I had at that time with the President of the United States. If you have the proof of weapon of mass destruction and the approval of the United Nations, I would be there. But I said, I don't think you have the proof of weapon of mass destruction, and if you don't have this proof, you don't want to have the United Nations. But even at that time, there was a movement to have the support of the United Nations. In the present situation, the United Nations is virtually non-existent. And this is sad. So I don't know if I've covered what you want me to talk about, but you told me not to talk about what you asked me to talk about yesterday. So give my floor to somebody else now.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Krachen. We now move to President Obasanjo of Nigeria. Lower oil prices benefit many consumer countries, but are not so benign for oil-producing countries like Nigeria. Nigeria is also undergoing its first democratic, peaceful transition. President Obasanjo took a public, courageous position there that we saw. And they also have to face the scourge of radical extremism with Boko Haram. So a lot of the things that are worries to the world are happening and are affecting Nigeria, which is the largest country in Africa. And as it goes, so goes Africa. So we now move to hear the comments from President Obasanjo of Nigeria. Mr. President.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Let me take, first of all, you've given me 3 areas to cover. Let me take, first of all, the issue of terrorism. Boko Haram, they are a terrorist group. And I will say they are a homegrown terrorist group. When you look at where Boko Haram is very right, in the northeast of Nigeria, and you compare the level of development in that part of the country, and let me take just one factor, education. In the southwest, around Lagos, where I come from, the level of education is 79%. In the northeast, it is 19%. A gap, such a wide gap in the same country. And you know what it means, the difference in education. It affects infant mortality, it affects maternal mortality, it affects all ramifications of health, it affects employment, it affects the totality of quality of life. And in a situation like that, any little thing will set off resentment, bitterness, anger. The man who actually started Boko Haram as a sect, they don't call themselves Boko Haram. They have a name for themselves. But what did he do? He himself has education, college education, he had no job. So he decided to take to preaching as an Islamic Malam. And on one occasion, he had following of college graduates, and he said to them, how long have you been out of university? 3, 4, 5 years. What job have you got? We have no job. Now, bring your certificate from the university. And they brought it. He said, if you spent 4 years in the university, and after 4 or 5 years out of university, you have no job, of what use is your education in the university? Tear your certificate. Some of them tore their certificate, and that's how they got the name Boko Haram. But really, when you have no job as a young man, you become a tool in the hands of anybody who will hire you. You become a tool in the hand of anybody who will make use of you. And that is the danger we have for Boko Haram, maybe for what is happening in Mali, maybe what is happening in Kenya, Al-Shabaab, but what is happening along the entire stretch of Sahel, from the tip of the western tip of Africa in Senegal to Djibouti. Now that is one problem. And from that problem you have another problem, migration. When there is conflict, when there is no job, when there is poverty, now people try to look for a greener field. And we have the story. They count the cost. All right, this is a calculated risk. Maybe, and maybe where I will go, it will be better than where I am. Maybe, no matter the danger, all right, let me chance it. And, well, they chance, and many of them die in the wet grave of the Mediterranean, wet mass grave of Mediterranean. And as we heard earlier on, now, is this not on the conscience of the world? Can we continue to live with this morally and politically? Yes. The answer is improvement in the economic and social conditions in the countries where these migrants emanate from. But before we get to that, what can we do and what must we do? The issue of employment for the youth in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is one issue that must engage the attention of the world. Otherwise, there will be no end, at least no immediate end, to having the Mediterranean as mass grave for young and frustrated Africans. Let me talk a little bit about another related, which the facilitator has asked me to talk about, the issue of democracy and elections in Africa. We in Nigeria have just gone through an electoral process, which is the first in our country, where we transition from one government from a different party to another government, particularly from the ruling party to an opposition party. It's never happened before. But what makes it as significant for us is that it happens peacefully, transparently. The election was reasonably free and fair and open. And even the defeated candidate, who is an incumbent, did not waste time to congratulate the winner. That was new. It was new for us in Nigeria, and I believe it is new generally in Africa. And many people see this. We in Nigeria, we see it as very good for us. We see it as taking us a step higher in the dispensation of democracy, in the process of democracy, and in the practice of democracy. But not only we in Nigeria, the whole of Africa see it as something good for Africa. Now, we have got election, free, fair, transparent, and credible. We have declared the result of the election, but democracy does not consist of only election. It goes beyond election. Election is good. It's a good manifestation of the practice of democracy. But then, good governance must follow. To have democracy and good governance, to be able to reverse the trend of unemployment, the trend of bad governance, the trend of frustration of the youth in our country. And talking about the lack of employment, we have seen what is happening in South Africa, xenophobia. The job that is not there, the youth of South Africa thought that the foreigners are taking the job from them, and therefore they do not want foreigners. And they took to the street. Now that cannot be good for us in Africa. So the answer really is yes, we have elections. Nigeria has shown the way, others will follow. But after elections, there must be good governance that will lead to socioeconomic development and prosperity. And unless we have that, then election will in fact become something that will be of no use. Just as the Boko Haram man said, look, if you have gone to college, you have spent 4 or 5 years in the university, and you have no job, of what use is your education? Tear your certificate. If you have had good election, if it has been free, fair, credible, and at the end of it, it does not give you enhancement in your living standard, it does not improve your life, then forget about it. And that is something we must not allow to happen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, President Obasanjo. We now move to Prime Minister George Papandreou. We've been with him at a few seminars. He comes from Greece, and if you Google News, many of our countries, I think he's always at the top of the list with the events in Greece. So we'd like to hear your comments about your country and the economic situation in Europe. Please, Prime Minister Papandreou.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up on what President Obasanjo said about good governance by referring to what President Aliyev mentioned, a simple truth, if you like. I say a simple truth because my slogan when I was in government is let's have the revolution of the self-evident, and I think we're talking about self-evident truths here. President Aliyev said that although resource-rich Azerbaijan in the past became very, very poor, even devastated environmentally, which highlights a simple fact that it's not enough to have resources, it's of utmost importance to manage them well. So I would add to the benefit of the public good, and that is what we talk about, good governance, which is central. But President Aliyev also highlighted the freedom Azerbaijan enjoys. And he felt that this freedom gives them the capacity to guarantee good governance. But my question would be, can this freedom be maintained simply by guaranteeing territorial integrity and independence? I say this because we are becoming more and more interdependent, economy and energy and communications and finance and big data, and our freedoms are dependent on managing and humanizing the global economy. And we're not doing so. And from my experience in Greece, yes, I had to take very, very difficult decisions, very painful decisions, to try to create good governance on the one hand, but also cut wages, pensions, benefits, and so on. And I did so because that was the way in keeping Greece alive and not going bankrupt. However, Greece alone could never have overcome its problems, and we still are struggling, but we're getting close, without the collective efforts of the European Union and I would say the global community. Indeed, as we were the first in this debt crisis after the Lehman crisis in New York, but because we were the first, the European Union took too much time to realize that this was not simply a Greek problem, but it was a European and a global problem, and therefore we needed a collective approach. Not having a collective approach meant the problem became deeper in Greece, but it also became a severe problem of contagion in Europe as a pandemic like Ebola was, and that is very much how we felt. This created this, I would say another point is having to adjust to the very strong pressures of the market very quickly, the swiftness and the depth of adjustment. Think of this as we lost 25% of our GDP, we have 50% youth unemployment, we have reached, of course, a primary surplus, but the costs are huge. This also has meant that the changes we made, the people don't feel that they own them, they feel that they were imposed. So that's a deep question of democracy. How do people feel if these are imposed, even if it is a change in supposedly towards the better, but they have very much pain, but they don't really own this process. So this is where then you have a reaction, and a part of the reaction is to, of course, change government, and there was a lot of promises from this new government. I would say over-promising, but it created a reaction from the Greek people. It had political ramifications, deep political ramifications, and helped a lot of the populism and mythology around what's happening in Greece, both in Greece and also in Europe. So what would be a conclusion here is that we are as a human race today, we have a paradox. We can solve problems. We do have the capacity to solve problems, but our institutions continue to be national or local, our politics national and local, basically national and local, but the problems are much more global today. And the butterfly effect affects us all. Boutros Ghali said in his message that actors are no longer states, referring obviously to groups that use violence. But violence will unluckily become an alternative for many if we do not manage our globe in a just and effective way. I just want to make 3 points before I conclude from my experience, what I see we need to do. First is we do need to humanize global capitalism. In the past, in developed countries at least, we had a basic bargain, or a social contract as we call it in Europe. It was between the state, the employers, the employees, guaranteeing profits on the one hand for the capitalists, but on the other hand, basic needs like health, education, jobs, environment, and so on, basic collective rights. Also the capacity we had to mitigate crises at the national level. Crises would hit us, but the nation could resist and deal with these crises. However, with globalization, we have the move of capital, the flight of capital, both to opportunity, but also away from obligations. I saw this in Greece, tax havens, offshores, tax competition have created a number of problems. First of all, robbing us of resources, but secondly, concentrating wealth in hands of few at the global level, creating more inequality and injustices. And then this comes back, and I've seen this in Greece, but it happens in many other countries with lobbies, and it captures politics. Politicians and politics become captured by these very big interests. And it goes all the way to, of course, deep corruption. So this is a huge issue we are facing for our democratic institutions, and not only in the less developed democracies, but also in the mature democracies. A second issue I think is important with the communications we have, with the speed of changes. with the capacities we have, we need to humanize our technologies so that they are used and not abused. And thirdly, democracy, I very much agree with the President of Nigeria, not simply elections. I would go back to the ancient concept, and I would say there are two basic things that democracy needs, the two basic principles. One is to be able to create a collective sense of rules and regulations and how we collectively in our consciousness work together to change our fate, to better our society. So rule of the law instead of rule of the powerful. But if the law is to be legitimate, it has to be a law that is accepted and created and founded even by our citizens and the people. The second important issue for democracy is that democracy is there to disrupt the authoritarianism or concentration of power or the abuse of power. That is also the basic idea of democracy from the ancient times. And I would, if we look at it, at global governance, we have to see then how do we disrupt concentration of power and wealth and inequality, but also how we create local participation, respect, and dignity. I will conclude by just a small example of some of our problems, and you have alluded to this. I was recently on a small, beautiful island in Greece called Agathonisi, which if you translate it, it would be the island of goodness. A beautiful small island, 187 citizens living on that island. And you would think it's sort of an idyllic place, isolated. Sometimes they say, oh, why don't I just leave? When we're in politics and under stress, we say, why don't we just go to an island and live there? It'd be great. But if you look and you go down deep into the sea, you'll see that it's not only colonized by ancient ruins, but by modern ruins of thousands of plastic bottles and waste coming from all these tankers and so on. The fish that are changing coming from other exotic areas because of the offload of tankers. And once in a while, you'll wake up in the village square, and all of a sudden you'll have maybe 200, 300, 400, 500 Afghanis or Syrians or Iraqis on the island. What I'm saying is that we are no longer isolated as islands. We cannot go back to a tribalism and a nationalism. These problems are too global. And I think we have basically two roads to follow. Unluckily, one is the retrenchment, as the Canadian Prime Minister mentioned. And that would be the nightmare of fragmentation, of chaos, of recession, of unemployment, solutions going back to a violent, very often nationalism or tribalism, xenophobia, racism, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or whatever. Or on the other hand, furthering global integration with rules, with codes of conduct, with an ethical compass, with adequate institutions. And I see as politicians that this is our responsibility, to create a global consciousness, become educators as politicians, educate citizenship, and empower our citizens to be able to overcome national and religious or what other gender or other divides, so that we can work together and utilize our capacity for the betterment of the human race. Coming to Europe, Habermas, the German philosopher, has said, what we need is not we need patriotism. We do have patriotism, and I like the difference between nationalism and patriotism, which was mentioned earlier. But he talks about constitutional patriotism, which would be a patriotism towards global values, to values. And that is what Europe, I think, is a project today, which used to be simply a peace project, but now I think it's a project of how do we develop global values in different nations, different traditions, different languages, different ethnicities, particularly when we've had wars, where we unite around these global values. And that would be constitutional patriotism, according to Habermas. That, I think, is the challenge of Europe. And we have been tested by the financial crisis, and there's been a lot of populism and nationalism that has grown. I do hope that the European project will succeed, because if it does succeed, it will become a true model for global governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Papandreou. We now move to the former president of Slovenia, Danilo Turk, good friend, not only former president of Slovenia, but he worked for a long time inside the UN bureaucracy. Comments have been made here as the UN is non-existent, or the need to revamp international architecture. Many of us are always asked, what would you do if you were UN Secretary General? My answer is nothing, because I never will be one. But Eastern Europe's turn is coming up. I don't get a vote, but if I had one, I would give it to Danilo Turk to be the next UN Secretary General. The President of Bulgaria, he has a vote. Maybe he can give it to him. So let's listen. Perhaps in the future he will be Secretary General, and he have a chance to put into practice many of the things that we're talking about here. Danilo, please.
Thank you, President. Let me explain, by way of introduction, that I also, like Prime Minister Chrétien, expected to speak on another subject last night, and that was Europe and its relations with the European Union, its relations with the East. And of course, in a way, this is a simpler subject than the one which I'm asked to comment today. Therefore, I take this not only as a surprise, but also as a kind of promotion, really, because from regional to global questions, of course, one can see the difference and the need to look at things in a broader sense. I'm also very lucky to have been asked to speak after Prime Minister Papandreou, who actually set out a very good global agenda, if I may put it this way, a set of rather pedantic aspirations, I would call it. Humanize global capitalism, humanize global technology, make democracy real and globally progress. I think that these are very valid points, not only points, they are valid aspirations, and the question is, how does the world come closer to these aspirations? How does one make them more real? Because I believe that there are many people, there are many thinkers and policymakers around the world who would very easily agree with this set of three major aspirations. Of course, things become more complicated when the question is asked, well, what is going to be your contribution? What an organization can do, what individual states can do. Now, this brings me to the United Nations, which was mentioned today several times, including by former Secretary General Boutros Ghali, who spoke about the need to bring something new to the organization. He described the UN as an old organization. I'm not sure whether I can fully agree with this definition, but it reminded me of something that was the slogan of a much older institution, namely the Catholic Church, which at the time of the Pope John XXIII developed what was called at that time the policy of aggiornamento, adjusting to the changed world. And I believe UN needs that too. And without going into all aspects of possible UN activity, I would like to make 3 points. One, how should I say, note of caution, and 2 suggestions. The note of caution is fairly general. When one talks about multilateral institutions, there is often a sense that the premise from which the discussion starts is one of omnipotence, that, you know, institutions can do everything, that institutions can change everything. One has to be careful. Institutions can do certain things, but they have to have very clear and not too large set of priorities. Policy making is always about priorities, and priorities have to be set right. This brings me to my 2 proposals, or 2 suggestions for discussion. Since the UN is basically an institution devoted to international peace and security, it will have to think very carefully and very clearly about the changes in the world and the needs to adjust its policies and structures to those changes. One of the key changes, I believe, has to do with the world becoming increasingly multipolar. This is not a new diagnosis. This is probably the way things are going. After the ending of the Cold War, we have had a certain period of unipolarity, which was actually quite unusual. We had a high level of strategic stability in the world, but practically an absence of balance of power. Now the world is changing towards a different balance of power and less strategic stability. And the UN is there to try to find a way forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily going to succeed, but I believe that the permanent members of the Security Council are and continue to be the key players in that regard, in that global balance of power and the need to develop what I would call a global security compact. And the UN should work for that. Now, Global Security Compact is something that entails various tasks, some of which have started and some of which have to be developed further. I believe that there are two areas of security where UN has to do much more. I think UN is doing quite a lot in Africa and will have to increase that work over time. But UN has to develop a higher profile in the larger Middle East and with regard to the crisis of Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to speak about individual crises or specific elements, but I believe that progress in those two areas is necessary to develop a renewed global security compact which is needed in an increasingly multipolar world. This is my first proposal. The second proposal has to do with the role of state. Now, UN is an organization of states. It is based on the principle of sovereign equality of its member states. And that, of course, is a very important platform. And UN cannot be neutral to the fact that the role of states is being weakened in the developments of the last decades. That is to some extent natural, but it brings very serious problems with it. So the experts will tell you that today the world faces a situation in which up to 40 states can be described as failed or failing states. And that, of course, is a big challenge to the UN as an organization of states. Now, what is to be done? I think UN should develop its advisory function with regard to the functioning of the state. Some of that work is being developed. I believe that the whole discussion on development goals is about that. And I believe that things can be done in a very concrete fashion through the use of modern technologies, information technologies, which can improve the statistical understanding of the problems of states sufficiently early so that the advisory role of the UN can be expressed more efficiently, more early, with greater effect. And then, of course, there are other aspects of advisory role which can also be developed further. Finally, I think UN has to work in very close cooperation with other multilateral actors. UN is not alone. It works in partnerships. But in order to come closer to the objectives that Prime Minister Papandreou spoke about, it is vital for the UN to enhance its cooperation and to develop new formulae with Bretton Woods institutions, the regional economic and other actors, and of course in the security field with regional security actors. Again, this is a complex agenda, but a vital one, and it has to do with the fact that none of the international institutions can be seen as omnipotent. All together can make a difference. And I think that that is a basic task for the UN as a central multilateral organization to work with everybody else in a way which does make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, President Turk. We now move to the last panelist. Needs no introduction. Longtime Secretary General of the Arab League, Amr Moussa. And I've learned when you go to the seminars, if you want to understand better what's happening in that important, critical region of the world, is to listen to Amr Moussa. So please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe that this session was very interesting. The campaign for the next Secretary General of the United Nations has just started. And also the former Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, was very eloquent in inviting us to go and visit Greek islands and contribute to the revival of the Greek economy. I'm one of those who I am going to visit that this summer. Thank you. The title of this meeting, Building Trust in the Emerging New World Order. In fact, trust is a key word. Very much so, because the lack of trust in the international system has contributed to the erosion of the credibility of the system and necessitated debates about what kind of a new system we should adopt, we should create after the failure of the current one. The two presidents this morning, and I believe more than that, President of Azerbaijan and President of Bulgaria, have spoken about a major impediment, which is double standard. Double standard in policies, especially of the big powers, have led to crisis, tension, lack of security and lack of stability in many countries. Not only double standard, but also double talk. We witnessed through the years how things were said publicly and the opposite was said in the closed rooms. I would say that even on terrorism and terrorist organizations, we hear, all of us here, that all of us are against terrorism. And it is a global stand, and we have to stand tough, to stand together in order to defeat terrorism. But you know that several terrorist organizations are being financed by some of the same powers that are being talked, or at least tolerated and helped. That is what makes many of us angry, that the situation or the international system is not serious and cannot really lead to reach our goals, our common goals, in stability, in prosperity, and in peace. In the Middle East in particular, after this major change and revolutions, it is not the title Arab Spring is a wrong one. It is the expression of the people of our region that they want a different system of government, they want democracy, and they want to link up with the 21st century. This is a must. We cannot continue to link up with the past, either the distant past or even the last century, the 20th century. We have to look forward, and in this, I believe we are going to succeed. What we need is a new regional system, not only a new international system, but a new regional system, especially in the Middle East. Talking about defining the Middle East, I mean West Asia, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. We will have to talk about it, to sit and debate what kind of system do we need. Political, security, economic development, justice, the rule of law, all those issues will have to be debated in the suggested, expected, predicted new regional order in the Middle East with this definition I just mentioned. When we talk about a regional system, I also mean a security system, regional security system, that must have two objectives. One, to combat terrorism and extremism, and the second one is to establish a meaningful system of security, including debating clearly, cleanly, the nuclear situation in the Middle East. So a new regional system, a new security system that would by necessity and the realities of geography, the Mediterranean and the southern European countries, including Greece, Italy, France, Spain and Portugal, and also the Balkan countries. This system should also have a new economic institutions. We need a regional bank of development. We need to direct our immense wealth to rebuild the country. And I believe that some of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Kuwait, have embarked on that when they found that Egypt needs help, and Egypt is going through one of its most difficult situation in its recent history. They came up with immediate help, organized and delivered properly at the times as they have promised. So the idea in the Middle East that this region needs a new system of relations, a new system that brings countries together, cooperating against the impediments for peace, for security, for stability, and for cooperation. And this requires, in all honesty and with the clearest of terms, that the Palestinian question has to be resolved. It cannot stay lingering, and it will not. The idea that now all Arab countries are busy with their own problems and that the Palestinian question has no sponsors or promoters is a wrong one. In order to have a new system, a new life, we will have to address this question, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in particular the Palestinian question. This needs an honesty in dealing with the problems, to put an end to the double standard in the policies in practicing relations with the Middle Eastern members of the international community. This brings me to what has been said this morning and in this session about what the Prime Minister Chrétien has said about the West losing interest in the oil and perhaps in the Middle East. Mr. Prime Minister, this will be the happiest day for us after all what happened from several countries that have sown havoc in the Middle East and in the security in the Middle East, the prosperity of the Middle East, justice in the Middle East. This could have been done had there been no intervention, and in fact very negative interventions that brought or kept problems lingering without solution and introduced this principle of manage the problem. You don't have to solve it, just manage it. And we paid a heavy price for that. So, Mr. Prime Minister, if they so decide, it will be a very positive step on their own. The second one, about the Security Council reform. I really don't believe, and I'm a practitioner of the United Nations for so many years, I don't think that the Security Council will be subject to any reform. It is an impossible proposition. And the impossible proposition emanates from the fact that the Security Council has become a tool. Now the Security Council doesn't have this reputation of the most important council in the international system. It has become unable to solve any problem. The public opinion has lost faith in that council, and reforming it according to what is being said in the United Nations will add nothing. If you want to reform the Security Council, we'll have to address the issue of veto and the issue of who indeed is the president of the Security Council. who indeed is the chairman of that body, not the president in exercise from the first day of the month to the end. But what happened in Iraq? What happened in Syria? What happened in Yemen? What happened in Ukraine? What happened? So what did the Security Council do? Nothing. Because it is the tool in the hands of certain few superpowers. If we want to reform the Security Council, we have to reform the United Nations, which is another impossible proposition but it is a subject that is very interesting for all of us, diplomats in particular, to talk about the Security Council, that 25 or 22 members or 25 members, and what kind of veto and second-class veto, the new rules of procedure. This is a tall order, but this is not the issue. And the third point, and the final one, is about the frozen problems, the frozen conflicts that the President of Bulgaria has talked about. This is, in fact, a problem of its own, that sweeping things under the rugs, froze issues, manage problems, and keep things as they are. This is a sign of inability of the superpowers to deal with problems. And I think that reading the international situation, it will be a gradual replacement of the current system, either the UN system or the Bretton Woods system. Now China is offering a major bank. Countries are hurrying to join that bank, and I believe there will be other steps on the economic side as well as on security side, that we cannot depend anymore on the system as it exists today, and we're not going to take any promise that we will take care of you, we will protect you. All those things won't work anymore. In the Middle East, finally, I am sure that the new situation that has emerged after the revolutions, in particular in Tunisia and Egypt, has already produced a new Middle East. We have the power of the people now. The people knew how to say no. We do not accept any president in the Middle East, or I believe in the totality of the third world, cannot be just called by phone and the president will say, all right, I will do that. I don't think that any president will be able to say it. Will say, all right, I will have to go back to my people, to my institutions. That is why democracy is very necessary. And I'm glad to say that the elections of the parliament in Egypt are going to take place within the next very few months. Democracy is the name of the game. We live in the 21st century, and we want all of us to live in it and reap the fruits of the advanced technology, as Boutros Ghali was saying, and to work together to a better world. But I don't think that we have done so under the existing international system. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Emmer. We have about 10 minutes. I've been told by the organizers that the Ukraine session, which I'm sure is very important, interesting for many of us, because of the time that we have, will be moved to tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have 3 former presidents of Ukraine here. So for those of you that were waiting for that session, that will take place tomorrow at 9 a.m. We will go to lunch at 1:30, but before we go to lunch, we have about 10 minutes. So we will take 2 or 3 questions or interventions from the floor. Please make them brief. Try to put a question somewhere in your intervention, your name and who you're addressing it to, and then we have about 10 minutes. I have President Lacalle here in the back. I got it. Is there a microphone? Okay, it's coming. President Lacalle.
Yes, good morning. I'm Luis Alberto Lacalle. from Uruguay, member of the Club de Madrid. And I will add one more angle to the subject of migration, which I think has been left behind. People don't flee their country, their village, because they like to. They're not leaving, they're fleeing, they're running away. And one measure that could stanch that kind of bleeding of those countries would be a freer trade. Europe has been very selfish in its commercial policy, with all the barriers against we small countries or third world countries or exporting to European Union. And I think that freer trade will make many people in Africa stay in the countries if they can make a living in their countries. And free trade is one of the opportunities of rooting people in their own countries and make them stay for a profitable life and work. Thank you.
The microphone, can it be passed to the back here, please? Back to the lady here. Thank you.
Спасибо. Я из Киргизии, депутат парламента нашей республики, лидер оппозиционной фракции «Атаджурт» Джилдыз Джилдошева. У меня такой вопрос последнему выступающему, господину Амир Муса. Скажите, пожалуйста, если перевод был правильный, вы сказали, демократия – это название игры. Получается, что великие державы играют демократию. Я так поняла. Это первый вопрос. Второй вопрос. Вы сказали, что Китай предлагает крупные банки. А создание крупной банки и вообще эта крупной банковской система, она оправдает ли себя? Не приведет ли к тупику? Почему? Потому что крупные банки обычно, не дай бог, если начнется какое-нибудь финансовое нарушение, это приведет к такому великому катастрофу. Почему? Потому что там крупные акционеры играют, одним словом. Вот на два вопроса ответьте, пожалуйста. Спасибо. Но ваше выступление было классное. И я хочу сказать, да, была критика в адрес Совета Безопасности ООН очень серьезная. Я надеюсь, что они обратят на ваше выступление. Спасибо.
Thank you. Towards the back, please. We'll take one more towards the back there, please, and then we'll hear from the panelists.
Thank you very much. My name is Setambilem Lodge from Zimbabwe. I should think my question is relevant to the former president of Nigeria. Can ordinary people trust that in Africa that a former president like yourself leads a delegation to observe elections and does not report the true reflections of the people's aspirations? Can the ordinary person trust that a former president of an African state can really report the reflections of the people in a vote? I'm saying so because Zimbabweans are being butchered in South Africa, whereas His Excellency Honorable Mbeki in 2002 did not report the true reflections of an election. I'm really concerned about that one. And Also, to the last speaker, the Secretary General of the Arab League, about China's banks. In Africa, China is offering loans and everything with no strings attached. But we see that China donates some equipments in the countries like ours, and at the same time, they want to mine the minerals where they are not given. So is it the opening of banks with no strings attached, or it is to loot in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. We'll take them first, the comment on trade and as a way to address some of the migration issues in Europe. Perhaps President Turk, Prime Minister Papandreou want to comment on Europe, the migration issues, and the possibility of expanding trade with other parts of the world?
Yes, I'm very much in favor of free trade, and I know we need to open up even more so in Europe. I would only say that free trade alone, from my experience also, is that we need to see how there's also fair trade. We talk about Africa, we talk about the conditions of the human beings, the laborers, we talk about the standards of living. These in the WTO have not been highly highlighted and prioritized. And that has created a race to the bottom, often in free trade, rather than a race to the top. So I would say yes to free trade, but let's also look at some of the basic things to help countries so that there will be more of an equal playing field in competition, but also guarantee some basic rights for employers, for the employees and the laborers in the countries, in the developing countries. Secondly, on migration, first of all, again, we need a collective response in Europe. There is not really a collective response in Europe. We need to develop this. That means that we need to go beyond the idea of, again, the nation state. Even though we are a European Union, there are many things that are still very national. We need to see how we, on the one hand, yes, the security of our borders is one thing, but on the other hand, we need to really think about our demography in Europe. We are an aging population. We need to see how we integrate migrants into our countries so that we avoid xenophobia. And I would say looking at turning the coin around, because there's a lot of xenophobia, there's a lot of fear of migration in Europe. I would like to see migrants from third countries becoming the first truly European citizens. Therefore, they would not have a root in one or another country in Europe, but we should give them some form of a European citizenship where they will really feel members of Europe. So let's think of these types of new ways of approaching the issue of migration. Certainly, migration is a complicated issue. People are fleeing for certain reasons, and if we don't look at the core issues of whether it's conflict or whether it's climate change or whether it is just the fact that they just cannot find jobs and they need a different standard of living, these are core issues which if we don't deal with, we will always have these pressures. And there will be issues of security, as you have said. I know in Greece we have at times had 400 or 500 people coming in per day and on our borders. And in a small country, particularly when we have an economic burden, this creates a lot of xenophobia. And we can only deal with this in a collective way. But at the same time, we need to see not only the security of the borders, as I said, but also the integrating of these new citizens into our societies in a way where they espouse certain values. Again, I would come to the concept I mentioned earlier, this idea of global citizenship. Going back to ancient Greece, at some point there was a big debate about slaves becoming citizens or migrants becoming citizens. At some point there was a very progressive regime in Athens saying, yes, let's make them citizens. And a philosopher called Isocrates said, well, what will happen is, does that mean that a Greek means only persons that are educated Greek? And that was what he was basically saying, is that if you espouse the same values, you can be part of the society. It's not a question of race, of ethnicity, of where you come from, of blood, but it's a question of values. And I think this is the kind of approach we need in Europe also.
I'd just like to add one or two points, while basically agreeing with free trade and fair conditions of trade as being an instrument to deal with the problems of migration and to reduce the situations in which people are then forced to flee from where they live. There are security questions involved here. And for Europe, I think it is important to think in a very sensitive way about the need to do no harm. Because sometimes policies produce harm, including in the security sense. Think about Libya and think about destabilization that has happened following military action in 2011. One has to study that lesson very carefully and make sure that in the future no action from outside Africa creates additional instability in Africa. That, I think, is a very important part of the solution for the future, and something that Europe has to reflect upon more carefully than it seems to be the case today. Again, for the United Nations, I would say it is important to understand that in the UN, questions of migration have not been put on the agenda in any systematic way so far, which probably says a lot about the complexity of the problem and the difficulty to handle it at the international level through political institutions. And this, I believe, only reinforces my insistence that all states act in the spirit of this ancient requirement, do no harm.
Thank you. Amr, please, you had a couple of questions on democracy being the key to the game, and then issues on the China Development Bank and the effects that it could have for development.
Thank you. On the question of democracy, when we work to establish democracy in our countries, this is because we believe that democracy is a better system of governance that would benefit the people. It is not to please any country. It is not to just cater to the interests of this or that big power or superpower. Democracy is there to ensure a better governance under the observation and the follow-up of the people and their representatives. Again, it is not to please any country. We don't care about that, but what we care about is our governance and why what happened has happened because of the wrong or the bad governance that has accumulated in our countries. As for the question of the 2 points raised about China, in fact, I was not considering, although I sympathize with some of what the two ladies have said about that, and I understand the motives behind that, but I was discussing the system, the current system, and the beginning of the challenge, real challenge to the system as a sign of its failure. And part of it is what China is doing or embarking on to do. So the challenge is there. It has started with not only just criticism or policies here or there, but actions and institutions to be built. And this is what I meant by, look what China is doing, because this has to do with a new world order. And this is the beginning of signs of how it would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll close comments with the last two panelists. President Obasanjo, you had a question addressed to you, and then Prime Minister Krachan, some closing comments as well, particularly vis-a-vis the UN and its reform, if you'd like to make some.
Thank you very much. The question is, can a former president, or anybody for that matter, leading an observation mission to an election in any country give the accurate situation or report of what the situation is. Let me start by saying, when you send observation mission, let me take AU for instance, the earliest they send observation mission will be a month before an election. And the longest they stay after the election is a month after the election. So a maximum of 2 months. Now, what you can see in those 2 months, I will say, with all due respect, that is minimal. Now, one of the first lessons I learned in my own country many years back, I was building a 4-bedroom house, and I called a politician friend of mine. I was still in the army. I said, let us go and look at this, my house under construction. And he didn't know where the house is. As we were nearing the house, he said, oh, look at that house. Now, if it's during politics, there will be about 50 people living in that house. I said, look, that's the house we are going to. It's my house. It's a 4-bedroom house. How will 50 people be living in it? And his comment is that rigging an election begins with registration of voters. Now, that was rather instructive to me. Now, if you send people to observe election in any country, and the rigging of that election started with the registration of voters, which might have taken place a year or even more before the election observation team comes. Now, there's not much the election observation team can comment or can see about that. They will go around, they will see, they will meet people, but what has been done to cover up or to inflate or to eliminate names, you cannot blame that on the observer mission. Now, it's also not easy, and let me give you just the example of the one I've just done. I've just observed the election in Sudan for AU. Now, first, some significant political parties boycotted the election. Now, there's nothing I can do as chief observer mission of AU except to report that some significant political parties boycotted the election. The turnout was low. Now, there's nothing I can do as a chief observer mission for AU observing election in Sudan to increase the turnout. And the election was even extended by 1 day. The government itself felt that there had not been, the turnout was low. But in spite of that, the turnout was still low. It was reported. The Amnesty International made the point and wrote to me as observer mission to say some rights, human rights, were being suppressed. And we could see it on the ground. We reported it. Now, having said all that, I then said, look, from what we can see, having pointed all these things, from what we can see, the voters that turn out, the result of the election will reflect the will of the voters. That's all I can say. I did not say it will reflect the will of the people of Sudan, because less than 30%, I think, the turnout was less than 30%. That cannot be the will of the people of Sudan. But the will of those who voted, the result reflected it. Now, and I don't see how much else we can do. Now, what we must insist on is that, and at the end of that report, I also make recommendations, because the reason why some people boycotted the election was that they wanted dialogue before the election. And government decided to have the election before dialogue. And I recommended that, look, the election should not be a hindrance to a dialogue. Dialogue must, in fact, go on. So I will say to you, my dear sister, that, look, what is important is the people, the electorate themselves, to be able to ensure that elections in their countries are what they should be.
Yeah.
There's nowhere where election is absolutely perfect, but the result must be able to reflect the will of the people, not just the will of the electorate or the will of the voters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister Chrétien.
Yes, I think that everybody wants to go and have a lunch.
Yeah.
Now, you know, on the evolution of the UN, you know, it's not moving. You mentioned earlier that the 5 countries who have a veto rights will never let it go. And but what, you know, there is some change. For example, the G7 started G5, went to G7, G8 to G20, but it takes time and it's very slow. The IMF, they made a little bit of room there, but not fast enough. But what you can see with the development of a new bank proposed by China, it might be, as you said, the beginning of something important, that the people will probably come on, build institutions that will ignore the UN if the UN cannot play the role they used to make.
But Prime Minister, the G7 or G8 do represent a certain class of countries, not globally. And they cannot cater to the interests of all countries in the world.
It was a club. And the club's changed.
G20.
And I'm telling you that when the people have the impression that they represent not them, they move around. And it's exactly what the Chinese are trying to do at this moment. And I can forecast a lot of change in international institutions because those who are there are not functioning as they should. Anyway, I don't know, but something is happening at this time, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thanks for all this rich conversation. I thank all the panelists on what they did. And frozen problems, we don't want the lunch to be frozen. I think we reconvene at 3 o'clock before they have to freeze our lunch. Let's move on to the lunch. Thank you.